You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
I think one of the fun parts about Christmas is all the festive parts of it. Everyone's wearing red, and we have, wreaths decorating our doors. And yesterday we celebrated probably our 15th or so annual Christmas cookie decorating contest with the kids and their friends. That began when Kylie was like 4, and now that she's 19, we still have her and her friends decorating cookies. Our youngest is 13, and so a bunch of 13-year-old boys trying to get excited about making Christmas cookies when there's video games waiting to be played was still something that we, force upon our children, the festiveness of the holiday season. And with the story of Christmas, the songs and the decorations and the pageants where kids play all the parts of the women and shepherds and angels, we would imagine there would be remarkable fanfare in the birth of Jesus. But the way that Luke writes this birth story kind of catches us by surprise. It reads pretty dry. All the drama and spectacle seems to be kind of sucked out of it. This lyrical poetry is going to be replaced by prosaic talk of census and geography and birth order, as we'll see in a moment. In fact, in this opening passage that unveils the birth of Jesus, we don't even get the baby's name. Since Luke is such a gifted writer, we have to wonder why would his account remove all these embellishments that would fit so well into the Christmas story. I'll read this to you, Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. It sounds weird when we think about it. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and the family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. That's it. We would expect a little more, maybe. Luke begins in this telling of the Christmas story by reminding his readers that the people of Israel were subject to the whims of a foreign king, and that if the king wants to make himself feel important by counting all of his subjects, well, you have no option then to take your family on the road and make a journey to your ancestral hometown, which is what happens. It's sort of like beginning like the scrapbook of your kid's birth with all the newspaper clippings of the terrible things that happened that year to remind us of the dumpster fire that was the year you were born. Remember when we were oppressed by the foreign king and we couldn't do what we wanted to? That's the year you were born, Jesus. And so these decrees went out to Joseph and Mary from Nazareth, a town with a pretty bad reputation. It was kind of a suburb of a bigger city that was mostly Gentile-oriented. Nothing good comes from Nazareth was the town, the kind of the slogan. And from Nazareth, now Joseph and his family will go to Bethlehem, a town with absolutely no reputation. Beyond the fact, David was born there. He left home as soon as he could, and that's when he became a great king. Your claim to fame was like 1,000 years ago, literally. Nothing else is happening in Bethlehem. And to make matters worse, in the minds of the readers at least, we're told that Joseph is engaged to Mary and she's expecting a child. That's not the way things are supposed to happen. That's out of the order of normal, polite society. And here they are bringing a child into the world that can't even manage to provide sustainable housing for them as they prepare on this little family trip. The baby is made to lay in a feeding trough and wrapped in spare cloth that's lying around this barn. So Luke begins his account in chapter 1 with this explanation of, I'm about to tell you a story that explores how the promises of God have come true in Jesus. But this seems to be a strange way to make that case, that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the world's true king. This story is a story, but it's not the way it's supposed to be, at least the way we would imagine it to be. And maybe you found yourself thinking that over the past holiday season. That for all the ways that we could imagine life to go, for all of the promises that are just waiting to come true, the dreams that we have held of what this year could be, Well, this certainly isn't it. Maybe you found yourself displaced by some power beyond your control, forced to disrupt your plans at the whims of fate or some other person. Maybe you carry within you shame or embarrassment of not having enough of whatever it is to make you belong or feel good about being you. Maybe you come from some hick town where few people manage to escape, and the shame of that past is worth trying to cover up. But for whatever reason, maybe you find yourself on the outside of hope or joy or goodness. And I think that's why Luke starts his story in the way he does. That this holy family, now venerated, once was quite simple, ordinary, plain, having trouble making ends meet, the shame of their community. But even within this rather plain story lies all the hints and promises of something grand, that Luke has planted seeds within this rather dry story that might bring out to us what hope in the presence of God looks like. Because we start by reading of Caesar, the world's king. There is royal background laid in our story that Luke is pointing at and making fun of. For all of this regal talk of census and Caesars and Quirinius, there's another king being born. Because that king, Caesar, will find himself dethroned pretty soon, not replaced by yet another tyrant with a different name, but by this infant, tender and mild, as we say. We may believe that this tyrant king called Caesar commanded travel at his whim, but what we see in the whisper of the line of Bethlehem is that God's promise that the world's true king would come from there, and that God would orchestrate the arrival of this king. And so the promises found in the Hebrew scriptures, they say, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, the one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. And then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel. And he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall live secure. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be the one of peace." What we find is that it was God who ordained the steps of Joseph and Mary to this little town, not Caesar. And the humble poverty of this world's true king makes those who share in this similar plight, those who find themselves unable to provide sufficient accommodations, even, part of God's family too. By refusing to come to us in these traditional ways of power, Jesus shows a different sort of power, a compelling power of hope and peace and love. Those things often sound weak to our ears. The naive belief that love has the power to change the world. But even the weakness of those things, coupled with the weakness of our insignificance and poverty and shame and powerlessness, when mingled with the presence of God, are the way that God's goodness come to the world. And that we are not kept out of experiencing the presence of God because of our own poverty, but instead we are welcomed and brought near to God because God pays special attention to those who are marginalized and overlooked, rejected, and dismissed. And so maybe we do find ourselves in another way saying, well, that's not the way it's supposed to be either. The overlooked are overlooked for a reason and should stay that way. The poor and the lonely probably got themselves into that mess. And yet God gives them special attention. What we find is that God is remaking the rules of the world in the birth of Jesus. And the wonder of Christmas for many of us is that we are here in this place in spite of all of the story of our life we could tell. That we find joy in these songs that we sing and in the festive decorations. And that for all of our cynicism and rejection of a story that says hope is alive, we can't help but cling to it. In Christmas, we hear the message of God's audacity, who would adopt the name Jesus, meaning God rescues, God saves, God delivers. God's true to God's promises. That God names himself Emmanuel. Not God over us, not even God rooting for us, but God with us. Not this distant God saying, go get him, but instead the God who is willing to be poor with us and to be shamed with us, rejected with us, overlooked and forgotten with us. That God would share our histories of nothingness even while God provides us everything. And so maybe parts of our life that, as the song would say, would long lay in sin and error, pining for the appearance of God, perhaps those stories are the very things that lead us to this little town, this little manger, this little king. And the ordinariness of our story is welcomed by the ordinariness of God's story. Even the ones who first hear the story of Jesus' birth, the shepherds who are working the night shift, are ordinary, mostly overlooked. But they are the first in a long line of ordinary people who not only worship Jesus, but who also share this message of peace and goodwill to all. And so my hope is that we can read our own stories as we read the story of how Jesus is born. That on the surface, both of these stories might seem rather generic, dry, boring, but underneath our stories are all the hints that the promises of God are coming true and that they are finding a way to flourish within our own hearts. That God is with you even in the parts of your story where God might seem absent, even the parts of your story that feel unimportant or painful or scandalous, that God remains, and that God is with us so that we might be rescued and brought near to this child, so that we might also worship, and so that we might find ourselves telling others of the blessings that we have received. That this simple manger is the birthplace of a faith that has reached to us, and that within the simplicity of our own lives, this love might find its way to others as well. Amen.